virtual BRLSI Spotlight, I'm going to be talking to Professor Ed Feil, who's Professor of Microbial Evolution at the University of Bath. I'm going to be asking him some questions about the virus that's causing the Covid-19 pandemic. And I should explain to everyone watching that Ed is my colleague in the Biology and Biochemistry department at Bath, and that I'm interviewing him remotely from my home through an internet link, partly because the university is closed, and also because both he and I are isolated at our respective homes on account of the virus. This will be the first in a series of interviews in which Ed and I will be discussing the pandemic.
The most extraordinary event of our lifetimes in the form of a pandemic disease caused by a previously unknown virus. And in general, we're getting loads of news about the progress of the pandemic in the form of numbers of infected people, numbers of deaths, plenty of instructions about what we should be doing about it. But we get much less information about the virus itself or the biological background to the pandemic. Sure. And evolution seems to be going on in the virus as we speak. It seems to me that it's a pretty good idea for people to know what they're up against. So I'm really pleased that you've agreed to talk to me today. And I'm going to start off with my first question. What is a virus anyway? Are viruses alive? Where do they come from?
So where do they come from is a difficult question to answer. I'll hit that one head on. The evolution of them is a little bit obscure, but what I can say to summarize about what they are is that the first thing to bear in mind is that they're not bacteria. A particular bugbear of mine is when you read articles about the E. coli virus in the paper. E. coli is a bacteria. Viruses are completely different. They're much smaller. They're about 100 times smaller than bacteria. They're only about a maximum of about 0.1 micron wide, and the micron being a millionth of a meter. So you really can't see them with regular optical microscopes. You need specialized electron microscopes to look at them. They are incredibly simple. If they're alive, it's debatable. They're kind of on the edge of life. They're perhaps best described as replicators rather than living organisms. They have the ability to replicate their own DNA when they're within a host cell.
So they're kind of parasites.
They're parasitic. They're absolutely dependent upon a host to replicate their DNA, or in the case of coronaviruses, their RNA, which is like a modified form of DNA. They can remain active as what are called virions, or virus particles outside a host. And we've probably all heard about the risks of surfaces being contaminated with viruses, hard surfaces in particular, which plays a role in their transmission, of course. But they don't do anything on these surfaces. They just shut up shop. They can't replicate. They can't grow. The only way they can actually grow is within host cells, in this case, human cells.
Right. So how does a virus get in and out of a host cell?
Well, this particular coronavirus is interesting in its shape. So the reason why it's called a coronavirus is because it appears to have like a halo around it, and this halo effect is caused by, I happen to have a picture of one here. It's caused by these spikes, these proteins. Can you see that coming off the surface of the cell? You've all probably everyone's seen this picture in the news. So it's like a spiky ball, like the sort of old-fashioned mines that used to float around in the sea. And these spikes act like little keys, and they can dock onto or latch onto particular what are called receptor molecules on host cells. And this is a really important part of their life cycle. And really, it's a fundamental aspect of how they adapt and how they evolve and how they make particular jumps into new species. So this is a critical interaction involving these proteins on the outside of the cell the virus particle and the host cell.
So you mentioned there that the virus that we're up against here is commonly called a coronavirus. What's its proper name?
So coronavirus is the family of viruses. This particular virus, to give its proper name, is SARS-CoV-2, and it's called that because it's the closest virus that we've encountered before in terms of genetic similarity was the SARS virus. It's about 75% identical to SARS, so it's not desperately close, but that's the closest that we've known about before that's caused wide big outbreaks in humans.
So SARS was around about a decade ago, wasn't it?
Yeah, a bit longer. Yeah. So, and that was a different kind of disease in the sense that it was worse in the sense that it tended to more commonly cause quite bad symptoms. But critically, the difference in terms of controlling SARS was that there weren't any asymptomatic cases or any asymptomatic transmission. So the problem with this virus is that it's very stealthy. It can spread from person to person without those people necessarily knowing that they've even had the disease. So this makes it really, really hard to control. So there are other viruses, important viruses in the coronavirus family. There's MERS, which was made the host jump from camels. SARS made the host jump from civet cats, but probably all these coronaviruses have in common an evolutionary relationship with bats. So all these other intermediate hosts probably have at some point acquired the virus themselves from bats. So that's where the sort of evolution of these coronaviruses takes place within bat populations.
Gosh, what's special about bats?
Oh, that's a really good question. So bats are the most interesting and quite wild thing about bats is that they live a really, really long time. So given their size and given their heart rate, they're similar to sort of mice. And mice only live for 2 or 3 years. Bats can live for 30, 40, 50 years. And it's really not entirely understood how they live for so long. But it seems that they have a really good way of repairing their DNA. They have a really good, strong immune system. And it may be that because they're so long-lived, they can pick up lots of diseases, lots of viruses, and lots of pathogenic agents, which won't necessarily make them sick, but it means that they act as a reservoir for all these different types of diseases. That's one explanation.
And some of these bats live colonially, don't they?
Yes, they do. They all live together. And this is another interesting aspect, actually. So when we're thinking about how a virus might make a jump from an animal like a bat into a human, maybe through another animal, but these sort of host jumps are a really challenging thing for a virus to do because it has this sort of lock and key mechanism. The spike has to fit exactly with the receptors on the host cell, and host receptors, these sort of lock mechanisms, tend to be different for every type of different animal. So it's quite hard for a virus normally to make a jump from one species to another. But what may be happening is that through various pressures on bat populations is that more and more different bat species are living together, hibernating together in caves at a very high density. And that may be, this is all speculation, there's no hard data to back this up, but it's quite a plausible idea that because more and more bat species are living closely together, then there is evolutionary pressure for viruses to become more generalist in nature, to be able to jump from one bat species to another. And once a virus can jump from one bat species to another, it has it's more like a master key, then it's a smaller step to take to jump from a bat to a different host species altogether. So they become more generous. They become able to jump from one species to another much more readily. So it's an interesting way of thinking about the big picture about what the triggers for a pandemic like this may be. It may be, you know, one of the unforeseen consequences of habitat loss, of other kinds of pressures on natural populations, that we're changing their ecology, pushing species together which over evolutionary time haven't had that much ecological interaction, which is going to have a consequences for the diseases that they carry, for the parasites and the viruses that they carry, which of course may in turn have a consequence for the diseases that we pick up.
Yes, and of course, let's not forget that bats are mammals like us.
Absolutely, absolutely. You're not so far away. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So, what do we know about where all this came from? Donald Trump likes to call this virus the Chinese virus. You want to tell us about what we know about that?
Well, I mean, it's certainly true that the first cases described of this new virus, SARS-CoV-2, were in China. It's widely believed, and probably, I guess, still most likely, that it was linked to this seafood market, this wet market in this one city, Wuhan, in the Hubei province of China, where they were selling live animals, butchering animals from all over the world, not just from China. There were camels and ostriches and koalas and all sorts of different exotic species in this market. It's tempting just to speculate that one of those animals that was on sale and butchered at that market had picked up at some point a virus, probably from a bat or through some other intermediate host, and through close proximity to the humans in the market, it managed to make that leap. There are some question marks about that scenario. There are cases which go back to the first case of this new virus goes back to November, and the cases in early December as well weren't necessarily linked to this, obviously linked to this particular marketplace. So there's still a little bit of a question mark over whether that particular market was the point of entry, so to speak, into the human population. But nevertheless, suffice it to say that these wet markets are generally a pretty bad idea when it comes to sort of protecting public health. You know, pulling together exotic species from all over the world that we haven't had any particularly close contact with, and butchering them live like that is obviously a bad idea.
Yeah, well, it certainly seems like there are going to be some questions asked about this.
Sure.
So, what do we know about what happens when a pathogenic organism switches its host? What kind of evolutionary changes are likely to be taking place? I mean, is an organism that switches host likely to be more pathogenic or less pathogenic to its new host? What about that?
So there are two parts to this question. The first part is to think about the pathogen itself, the virus itself. So typically, we would expect a virus that's found itself in a new host to have to undergo a period of adaptation, to change, to make it fit this new host. But for reasons that we've just discussed, if these viruses have evolved to be slightly more generalist in bat populations, then it may become more kind of ready to hit the ground running when it's entered the human population. The other side to that question is the host itself. So we have not encountered this virus before. This is a new virus, wasn't known to science before, a couple of months, 3 months ago, 4 months ago, which means that we are immunologically naive to it. We haven't got any natural innate defenses against this new virus. So it takes us a time to build up a base level of immunity to this virus, and at the same time the virus will start to co-evolve with the host's immune system. So there's a general kind of common wisdom that states that over time, after a new disease agent has entered a naive population, over time the relationship between the pathogen and the host becomes less antagonistic, and the pathogen will become less virulent. That isn't always the case. It depends on all sorts of complicated trade-offs between how many hosts are available and how the pathogen is able to transmit. If it can make a good living transmitting from host to host to host, if there are lots of hosts available, then it doesn't necessarily need to evolve to become any less virulent. So it all depends on how many hosts are available and what and it may be that actually, if you imagine cholera, for example, cholera is a waterborne disease. It causes diarrhea. If the main mode of transmission in that case is contamination of dirty water, fecal contamination of dirty water, then actually the virulent symptoms, the diarrhea, actually helps the thing transmit. So it's not always the case that pathogens will evolve to lower virulence. Of course, we hope that it will in this case. There's some evidence that happened in SARS, that there were some genetic mutations, actually deletions, where parts of the genome were actually fell out, were removed, which actually led to slightly lower virulence in SARS. I have seen one report of some variants of SARS-CoV-2, this new coronavirus, from Singapore, which has picked up a very similar deletion, but it's not known yet whether that's going to result in a decrease in virulence. But by and large, as a very, very general rule of thumb, fingers crossed, if there are going to be mutations that change the virulence of the pathogen over time, then it is more likely that it's going to go to decrease in virulence than heightened virulence.
Yeah, I suppose the best way to think about this is that the viruses are all competing with each other to remain in the population. And I guess the longer they allow their host to move around and spread the virus as much as possible, rather than causing the host to go to bed with a hot water bottle, the better they'll do.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's true. And that's also why vector-borne diseases tend to be more virulent, because it doesn't matter to the malaria parasite if the human's incapacitated, as long as the mosquitoes can move around. Then there's no trade-off there. So but this of course isn't vector-borne, it's direct droplet transmission. But
so we're going to see, aren't we, over the next months, perhaps even years, whether this virus becomes a normal accompaniment of life.
Yeah, so whether it becomes endemic. And I think that's almost certainly the case now. So what happened with SARS is there aren't any vaccines for SARS. There aren't any antiviral drugs, but it's disappeared. At least we think it's disappeared. And that was through traditional basic quarantine, contact tracing, isolation, social distancing, all these things that we're trying to do now. It was, as I say, it was easier with SARS because the cases were more obvious and there wasn't any asymptomatic transmission. But I think it's unlikely that we're ever going to be able to do that with this SARS-CoV-2, because it's already in just about every country in the world. So I think we have to face the fact that it will become endemic. We're going to have to live with this thing now. So the big question then remains is about the vaccine. So we're told that it's going to take 12 to 18 months to develop a vaccine. I don't have any reason to doubt that time frame. it's going to go through a lot of obviously safety trials. They're going to have to manufacture it, going to have to globally distribute the vaccine. But then the question is, how long will the immunity last? So,
Yeah.
and that varies between the different types of coronaviruses, actually. So the really, what we haven't mentioned is that probably about a third of all cases of common colds are caused by a very benign types of these coronaviruses. And there you don't have very long-term immunology to those, whereas other members of the family, you have much longer-term immunity to them.
Yeah.
So we don't really know how long immunity will last once immunity is built up. The slightly encouraging signs are that this isn't a virus which is mutating very rapidly. It looks to be relatively stable. It's certainly, coronaviruses in general are more genetically stable than influenza viruses, for example, where you need a seasonal a new vaccine every year. So that's hopeful then that when a vaccine is produced, or when a level of immunity is built up in the population naturally, that immunity should hopefully last for a few years at least, if not 10 years, hopefully. But hopefully it won't be, disappear within a few months. Although, of course, we don't know yet.
We'll see.
We'll see. Yeah.
Okay, Ed, thanks very much. I think you've done a lot today to answer many people's questions about the virus that's causing us all currently to stay at a safe distance from each other. I hope that you'll be able to answer some more questions in the future. And this is going to be a series of interviews. So I'll see you next time. Meanwhile, stay safe.
Stay safe. Yeah.
Stay well.
Allergy. Yep. Okay. Cheers. Bye.
Bye.